Hale Esfandiari, the director of the Middle East program. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Henri Barkey at the Wilson Center. This meeting is a joint program between the European program and the South Europe program at the Wilson Center, and I'm delighted that my colleagues Christian Osterman and I think I saw John Stylidis here too are present. Our speaker today, Professor Barkey, is a visiting scholar in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., and the Bernard L. and Bertha F. Cohen Professor in International Relations at Lehigh University. In 2007, he was a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center. Professor Barkey served as a member of the U.S. State Department policy planning staff, working primarily on issues related to the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, and intelligence from 1998 to 2000. He has taught at Princeton, Columbia, the State University of New York, and the University of Pennsylvania. He has authored and co-authored a number of books, among them Turkish-Kurdish Question, Reluctant Neighbors, Turkey's Role in the Middle East, and European Responses to Globalization's Resistance, Adaptation, and Alternatives. His last and most recent article is Turkey's Transformers with Morton Abramovitz. We have copies of the article outside on the table. The article appeared in Foreign Affairs. It's a special privilege for me to welcome Professor Barkey because he's not only a colleague but a very good friend. And I would like to please remind you to close your cell phones because it interferes with all the cameras that we have in the back. So please close your cell phones, your iPhones, your Blackberries, everything electronic you have. Thank you very much, Henri. You have 30 to 35 minutes, and we would like to open the floor then to questions.
Thank you, Hadi. I also want to remind you that you say I'm your friend, but when I came to the Wilson Center as a public policy scholar, you decided to stay in Iran and not come back. I think it was because you didn't want to be here at the same time with me. So, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be back at the Wilson Center. My topic today is actually a topic that is a little bit, shall we say, not clear, because I don't have any very clear answers to the kind of spat that's going on between Israel and Turkey today, but it clearly has attracted a lot of people's attention, and it has become a little bit of a litmus test for this Turkish government's bona fides somehow in some parts, certainly in Washington. But what I would like to do essentially is, if you, in terms of organizing my talk, I'd like to divide it into four segments. Talk a little bit about the past history of the Turkish-Israeli relationship, i.e. before the AKP. To talk about the AKP's foreign policy, its conceptual underpinnings, and what it is it's trying to achieve. 3 is what happened to the Israeli-Turkish relationship under the AKP and kind of document the changes. And 4th is what were the causes for the change and what does the future portend. I hope I'll be able to do all this in 30 minutes, but in case I can't do it, let me just tell you what the future portends. Let me give you the answer. I don't know. So with that caveat in mind, let me start. I mean, there's no question that the Turkish-Israeli relations have reached a very low point at the moment. But it is not as low as it has been in the past, but it is also viewed very much in the context of what the Turkish-Israeli relationship had been built as over the last years. From the beginning of the state, the Israelis always wanted to have a relationship with a non-Arab Muslim world. In fact, with all the countries that surrounded the Arab world, and Ben-Gurion used to call it his periphery strategy, which meant Israel created relationships with Ethiopia, with the Lebanese Christians, the Kurds, Turkey, Iran. So that was essentially kind of trying to break through the isolation that the Arab world had imposed on Israel. For the Turks, actually, were the first country the first Muslim country, actually, to establish relationship with Israel after Israel's independence in 1949. But for the most part, you know, I'm not going to go into all the details, but Turkey was part of the Baghdad Pact, as you will remember, and during the Baghdad Pact, Turkish-Israeli relations took a little bit of a dive only because the Turkish government wanted to show the Iraqis that they were actually good allies with them rather than the Israelis. It is only in 1980, when the generals took over, that we saw a real decline again in Turkish-Israeli relations, when the generals downgraded the relationship to the second secretary, essentially 4 or 5 levels below an ambassador. But the Turkish-Israeli relationship took everybody interested everybody when suddenly in 1996 you see the burgeoning of what turns out what many people called was a new alliance in the Middle East, an alliance of like-minded states, an alliance of pro-Western states, an alliance of states that were not part of the Arab world. And this was in many ways seen as a very important breakthrough in that the relationship that would emerge would be one that is not just a political relationship and not just an economic relationship, but also would be a military relationship. And it is important to put some context around that. And there are 2 important reasons why this happened when it happened. Turkey was going through a period then when, following a 1995 election, an Islamist party, the Refah Party, or the Welfare Party, had emerged as a winner, at least winner with a plurality of the votes. And it was a period of great consternation for the generals. And the generals actually, starting in 1994 already, as the Refah Party was on its ascendancy, had started to improve relations with the Israelis. And in fact, what you saw in 1996 was the imposition by the generals on a government that was led by Erbakan, the head of the Refah Party, somebody who had essentially made his name as, I think it would be fair to say, a rabid anti-Semite, to call him that. And so they imposed it on him. It was, in a sense, it was probably a very humiliating thing for Erbakan to go through, having to sign a document that established very strong relations with the Israelis. And one thing we should remember is that Erbakan's great confidant at the time and his shadow foreign minister was none other than today's president, Abdullah Gül. So to the extent, I'll talk about this later, the relationship between the Erbakan government and today's government, there are some. But it was in many ways imposed precisely because it was designed to humiliate Erbakan. In fact, one of the agreement called for joint, at least for Israeli aircraft to train, and the Air Force and the Turkish General Staff decided, well, the best place to put the Israeli aircraft in Konya. Konya happens to be the birthplace of Erbakan's movement and also the seat he represented in parliament. So it was just, kind of rubbing it in, to put it lightly. But the other main reason was that Turkey at the time was engaged in a major counterinsurgency campaign against the PKK, and you will, this sometimes seems to be in dim memory, but Abdullah Öcalan, the head of the PKK, was having a relatively nice life in Damascus or the Bekaa Valley, and years of pressure on the Syrians had not managed to dislodge him. So the immediate reaction to the 1996 agreement between the Israelis and the Turks was especially seen in the Arab world as being an alliance against them. I think in retrospect, I mean, I argued this also at the time. I thought that much was made of this alliance, and that in fact it was not really an alliance that aimed that much against the Arabs, as much as it was, yes, a warning to the Arabs, but it was really mostly domestically related in Turkey. And in some ways it was a cold alliance because there was really not much support for the alliance in Turkey itself. But the most important benefit of the alliance came about in 1998 when the Turks threatened Syria with an invasion unless Erdogan was pushed. Abdullah Öcalan was kicked out of Damascus. The irony, of course, is that that was a bluff. The Turks made it look like they had troops on the border when they didn't have any troops on the border. It was a wonderfully executed bluff. The Syrians bought it. And more importantly, what people also forget was that at the time, the Israelis decided to send a signal to the Arab world that they're not party to this dispute and pulled back their forces on the Golan Heights so that the Syrians would not think that this was a pincer movement. But it doesn't matter. I mean, in many ways, this is what the Arab world believed, that it was a pincer movement, that they were going to be hit from both sides, and therefore Öcalan was sent packing within days, to the surprise of everybody. And then we know the rest of that story, but it's not. So this was a crowning achievement, if you want, of the alliance. But for the Israelis, what was very important was that Turkey became an export market for its defense industries. And for Israel, which has a defense industry but a small market, it needs as many markets as it can get. So for Israel, it was primarily that. But trade between the two countries did increase over time. Right, so let me stop this here in terms of the alliance, so-called alliance. I would like to re-emphasize the fact that I never thought that this was a very strong alliance. It was a relationship. It was a qualitatively different relationship than before. The two countries exchanged a lot of information. They did intelligence exchanges. So, I mean, clearly but it was not an alliance in the classical sense that we understand what alliances are about when you come to the defense of the other. That it was not. AKP's foreign policy. So AKP wins in 2002, and you have to understand that AKP always believed, and still believes, that Turkey did not play a very important role internationally, that it always punched below its weight. And in that sense, it was absolutely right. And what AKP tried to do from the beginning is to essentially improve or increase or expand its foreign policy options, and it did improve relations with the EU and clearly got a date from the European Union to start negotiations. But beyond that, it opened up embassies all over Africa, all over Latin America. There are interesting things happening. For example, the Turks and the African countries, the African Union, have a yearly summit which rotates between an African country and Ankara. As a result of that, the Turks won their first UN Security Council seat, the first one since 1960, when they shared their seat with Poland, so they only served for a year at a time. So Turkey started moving into the international scene, and with time we saw this new foreign policy that a lot of people have already talked about, but let me just emphasize a few points about it. What the foreign minister Davutoglu calls zero problems with the neighbors, a multilateral policy which involves everybody, a policy that builds on historical and cultural affinity. But fundamentally, I think that as some people in this town, unfortunately, have been going on saying Turkey is turning away from the West, but that's complete nonsense. I mean, the Turks are very intent on maintaining the relationship with the European Union and the United States. What they're doing is they're expanding the horizon. And in many ways, it makes sense. It's a rational policy to do. The more they expand their relations, the more they improve their relations with the rest of the world, the more they become important. And this is very critical to understand, that Turkey, in the words of Davutoglu, Turkey wants to be a central power. And what he means by that is a global power. I mean, you talk to Turkish political leaders, they keep emphasizing the fact that the world's 17th largest country, hence now in the G20, and you saw Turkey taking a very, very active role in diplomacy, and talk to Turkish officials. There's not a problem that Turkey cannot solve. You name the problem around the world, Turkish diplomacy will now be able to solve it. There is a great deal of self-confidence, but you also saw it in action in the sense that when the Georgian war started between Russia and Georgia, it was really a race between Sarkozy and Erdogan as to who was going to get to Moscow and Tbilisi first. This is unusual. Turkish foreign policy was never like that. Turkish foreign policy used to be completely inward. If you talk to them about India, they will say, oh, the PKK. If you talk to them about, I don't know, Egypt, they will talk about the PKK. I mean, this was a one-tone, one-tune foreign policy. And what the AKP has done to its credit is make Turkey essentially, I wouldn't say a global power, I wouldn't necessarily call it a central power, but it's only the beginning. Maybe things may prove me wrong, but nonetheless, a country that is being talked about, right? And this is the goal, and this is the primary goal. What is interesting about this is also the fact that this plays exceedingly well domestically. I think both Erdogan and the party get kudos from the public on their foreign policy initiatives. People like to see the Turks being well received everywhere, especially in the context of Israel, obviously, after the Davos Incident and after Erdogan's criticism of Israel, and his stock has gone up not just domestically but also internationally. So that plays very well. And shall we say, a rather unnamed foreign minister currently in power said to me, when there is a problem, the people expect us, he said to me, to go and intervene. Now, there is obviously the dynamic there. I mean, clearly, the more they do, the more support they think they have, therefore they feel they need to do more about it. But that's the AKP's foreign policy. I mean, moving ahead to what happened to the Turkish-Israeli relationship in this context. When AKP came to power, it was not looking to severe relations with Israel, or to I shouldn't say severe, but reduce the level of cooperation with the Israelis. On the contrary, I mean, I think AKP understood, and part of its, when you think of AKP's foreign policy and its importance in the region, AKP quickly understood that if it wants to be an important regional power, it has to have a good relationship with Israel. Because the one thing that makes the United States in some ways unique in the Middle East is that it talks to everybody except the Iranians. But it has, in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict, it talks to both sides. So if you want to be influential in that sense, you want to talk to both sides. And for Turkey, this was actually very important. And it was a card it had. And unlike Egypt, which had a peace agreement with Israel, Egypt's peace agreement was cold, or freezing cold, if you want. And by contrast, Turkey and Israel did not. The other reason, of course, was that something that goes back to the Özal years as to when Turkey started improving its relations with Israel, and that goes to the need to, especially for AKP as a pro-Islamist party coming to power, to soothe or to worried feelings, if you want, in Washington itself. I mean, who are these guys? After all, Washington knows who Erbakan was, didn't know who Erdogan and company were. There are a lot of people from those days who are in the party. So a way of soothing its relations with America, maintaining good relations with Israel was important. And of course, there's a perennial and unending problem of the Armenian genocide. And Ezal had started to use the American Jewish community and had developed a relationship with the American Jewish community in order to prevent the genocide resolution from passing in Congress. And to some extent, that was a very successful strategy. And as the bonds between the American Jewish community and Israel grew a lot. So Turkey, or the AKP, I should say, was not intent on upsetting that card. And in fact, despite crises in the relationship, despite the fact that Turks got upset at a number of things that the Israelis did, despite the fact that they also did things that really made the Israelis think twice about them and also created problems here. For example, bringing in Khalid Meshal after the Hamas elections to Ankara. And I say the emphasis here should be on Khalid Meshal. It's not the fact that they brought in a Hamas representative. They could have brought Hania, who actually was elected. But they brought Khalid Meshal, who's the head of the military wing of Hamas, and he's a guy who gives the orders to put bombs and so on and so forth. It wasn't like Jerry Adams in Northern Ireland that we talked to, but it was precise. But the Israelis essentially decided, that's okay. I mean, the Turks will go off the reservation at times, and we have done things they don't like. So both sides understood to some extent the limits of the breaking point happened with Gaza, obviously. But when you think about Gaza, I think one needs to remember that before Gaza, the Turks had been involved in these negotiations that were essentially made public in May of 2008 between Syria and Israel. These were sets of negotiations that took place in Turkey where initially, the Israeli delegation would stay in one hotel, the Syrians would stay in one hotel. The first time, the Turks stayed with the Syrians. The second time, they stayed with the Israelis. The third time, they put them in the same hotel, but still separate from each other. I mean, so this was a step-by-step process, and the next stage would have been finally face-to-face negotiations. Well, Olmert came to Ankara to talk about all of this stuff with Erdogan, went back, and 4 days later the Gaza War started. To Erdogan, I think this was unacceptable. And I think he just literally flipped, if you want, over this. It has to do, we can talk about his personality, but it has to do with the fact, I think far more important, that he was here very close to a major breakthrough. People already were lauding Turkey for its great role in the region. This would have been a crowning achievement to bring the two sides together. Now, I should emphasize here that it is very, very clear to me, and from what I've talked to, the people I've talked to, that the Syrians and the Israelis knew that a deal was not going to be concluded with the Turks. For a deal to be concluded, the Americans had to be at the table. And the Turks had earned a seat at the table, unquestionably. But without the Americans, and the fact that the Turks got involved in this had to do with the fact that the Bush administration had created a vacuum in the Middle East, and the Turks stepped into it. If there had been no Iraq war, etc., maybe all this would not have happened. It would not have been that easy for the Turks to get the Syrians and the Israelis together. Anyway, so that was the breaking point. And then from then on, we see a steep decline. I mean, there was a Davos incident, but it's one thing after another. There's not a day that goes by now where some Turkish official at the local level or at the national level or Erdogan doesn't say something pejorative or nasty about the Israelis. If you look at what Erdogan said, after Gaza, he said, well, 1,300 people died. Later, that 1,300 people became 1,300 civilians. And when he came back from the G20 summit a month ago, he said 1,300 women and children. So in his mind, not only, I mean, there's no question that the Gaza war was abhorrent to the Turks and the way, especially it was portrayed on Turkish level. So there was a natural reaction in Turkey to this. And the Turks have generally been much more pro-Palestinian. And so he is, after Davos, he became actually a hero, not just in the Arab world, but also in Turkey. So this changed and it has come to the point where now Israel is saying, forget it. Next, there will never be any Syrian-Israeli negotiations with the Turks in the room. Right? Because it's been, I mean, on the one hand, Erdogan talks about the Iran nuclear program being just gossip, and then he goes and attacks the Turkish-Israeli nuclear program. Well, I mean, you may not like the Israeli nuclear program, but it was not done under NPT. I mean, there's a whole difference between the issue of the NPT. Also, never criticizes the Pakistani bomb. I mean, you know, only the Israeli bomb is not okay. So I'm not, you know, the latest and probably the most damaging was over the visit of Bashir. I'm going to conclude in a minute.
You have time.
Oh, I do. Okay, good.
Yeah. 10 minutes.
So, in that case, I'll slow down. When the Bashir, I should say, Bashir of Sudan was supposed to come last week to Turkey, and there was this international outcry given the fact that there's an ICC warrant on him. He went on the defensive and said, well, first of all, he went to Darfur, and he saw no genocide in Darfur. Besides, he said, Muslims don't commit genocide. Besides, he said, what he saw in Gaza was a hell of a lot worse than what happened in Darfur. So when you escalate at this level the rhetoric, I think the Israelis, I mean, for the Israelis, it's going to be a very hard pill to swallow. I mean, they could swallow Mashal, they could swallow many other things, but this has gone a little bit too far. Now, I will explain why all this stuff is happening in a minute. But in terms of the cost to Turkey, it hasn't been huge yet. The only big decline has been Israeli tourism. 2008 was the high point of Israeli tourism in Turkey. Almost between 560 and 600,000 Israelis visited Turkey, and that number has nosedived, obviously, this year. But there's clearly a great deal of anxiety on Israel. And, of course, when you look at it from an American perspective, the United States, the last thing the United States wants is to see two of its allies at, shall we say, not at war, but clearly in really terrible diplomatic terms. Okay, so why is this happening? I mean, I have essentially 7, but they're all, some of them I've mentioned, but they overlap a little bit. I start with the Olmert insult. I think Erdogan took it very personally. Erdogan is a person who takes things personally. I mean, this is his character. It's not, I've talked to a lot of people around him and in other in other circumstances to realize that this is the case. It is a fact that, you know, he feels he was cheated from a huge diplomatic victory. And when you're this close and you're maybe dreaming, maybe he thinks he was going to get the Nobel Prize instead of Barack Obama. But, well, some newspapers in Turkey did write that should have happened. But it was a slap in Erdogan's face. Now, whether or not Olmert knew that he would start the operations 4 days later is immaterial. I mean, he must have known that there were preparations. I mean, you don't start a major operation like this like this. So he must have known. And to some extent, to me, it also shows how Olmert viewed that relationship. I mean, Israeli friends of mine, you know, blame Olmert completely for this breakdown in the relationship. And in some ways, it also goes back to the Israel-Syria deal, because I think that both Assad and Olmert, to some extent, played Erdogan. Both of them they needed something to show the public that things were happening. Both of them were not very serious about these negotiations. And clearly Olmert demonstrated it with the Gaza operation taking place 4 days after his trip to Ankara. 2, it's the domestic and international popularity that he has gained with this criticism of Israel. I mean, this relentless criticism to the point that you know, people in the Arab street say their own leaders have not criticized the way Erdogan has criticized the Israelis. And but one thing here I mentioned, I forgot to mention earlier, one of the drawbacks of the policy also was to kind of improve the standing of Hamas at the expense of the Palestinian Authority, and that was actually one of the side effects, if you want, of this. But at the same time, as much as he criticizes, he's not breaking diplomatic relations. One of the big telltale signs was a few weeks ago when the Turks disinvited the Israelis from a NATO exercise that takes place called Anatolian Eagle, which includes the Italians, the Americans, the Israelis, and the Turks, and it takes place in Turkey, and they summarily dismissed the Israelis, and then the Italians and the Americans, as a protest, refused to participate. But starting yesterday, I think, there's another military operation. This one, it's a much, shall we say, less visible, less dramatic, but it's a search and rescue operation that takes place between the Navy, the Jordanian, Israeli, and Turkish navies, and that has gone on. So, you know, it's a little bit, you know, the government does a few things that are very, very public, but also behind the scenes, it's trying to maintain the relationship. I mean, it is not going to reduce, at least in the near future, its relationship with Israel. It's not going to downgrade the. There's a new ambassador who just went to Israel, and he's a fairly senior Turkish diplomat. So they're not sending any Joe Schmo, so to say, to Tel Aviv, but. So, in a way, you can argue that Erdogan is having his cake and eating it too. He's benefiting from that ambiguity. It is a way of showing also your independence from the Americans. Right, and that is a very important goal for this government. People usually say March 1st, 2003, when the Turkish parliament said no to the American troops, that was the first sign of independence. I don't think so, only because the government wanted the resolution to pass. It's just the parliament did not go with the, but in terms of looking at it from the AKP government, that was not the case. But it is also showing a little bit independence from the American Jewish community. The truth is, and I'll talk about this in my next point, is that there is not much love in the AKP for American Jewry, and they always disliked the fact that when they came to the United States, they felt they had to talk to the American Jews among all the other groups, but clearly it was most important. But so anyway, it is a tool of showing we are independent, we can do whatever we want, we have our own stature. Number 4, and I would argue this is, you know, Israel's own making, it's Israel's isolation. There is very little price to pay today for the kind of stuff that Erdogan has said about Israel. Right? There's not an international price, certainly not a domestic price, and there's very little the Israelis can do in retaliation to Turkey, not that they would want to. I mean, I think it is not in Israeli interest to do it, and we saw essentially from Barak's response, and I mean, in Israel, Barak has said, look, let's cool it, let's go on, things will change, right? But it is mainly Israel's isolation, in part because of Gaza, in part because of the breakdown in the peace process that people blame the Israelis for. So it is Israel's self-imposed or self-created isolation which has given rise to an environment in which this happens. The great improvement in Israeli-Turkish relations actually happened after Oslo in 1993. So had there been momentum, a peace momentum, this would not have also happened. Look, I mean, I should say this. I mean, the AKP never had very warm feelings for Jews in general. I mean, look, even when Erdogan tried to go out of his way 2 months ago, at the university in Turkey, he wanted to say how wonderful the Jews are. He wanted to prove how smart the Jews are. And he basically said all the Jews do is print money. And they don't, I mean, he said, Jews are smart. They don't buy things. They rent them because they use their money to make more money. I mean, this is exactly the stereotypes that you think. So, I mean, there is this very problematic relationship, if you want. But it goes back to Erbakan. I mean, Erbakan, who really created this party. I mean, he's an old-timer. He's still alive, unfortunately for Turkey. But he built the party essentially on this anti-Semitic platform. And a lot of the leaders of the AKP come from that. Now, partially, number 5, it has to do with domestic politics. The Turkish military today is on the losing side of a power struggle. AKP, I mean, has now the upper hand in this. That doesn't mean that the military is less powerful than the AKP, but the balance used to be like this. Now maybe we are here. But nonetheless, and purely for reasons that are military's own mistakes, the mood in the country has shifted quite a bit against the military. And remember, this Israeli relationship had been imposed on Erbakan by the military. And this is also a way of pushing back. Now, I should also say that the military also has changed since 1996. In that, because I mean, it goes back to the Iraq War, it goes to the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government. The military is not as pro-Israeli as it used to be. I mean, it looks at it mostly as a very instrumental relationship, but nonetheless, it was a way to play domestically. Number 6. Now, is it? And this is a hypothesis, rather. Why? I mean, okay, he criticized Israel. He went after Israel once, twice, 3 times, 5 times. Why the 92nd time? In other words, why is it that he's continuing this? One possible explanation is that he is trying now to shift, having lost the Syrian Israel, and he realizes he's not going to get Israel Syria back. Maybe he wants another project in the Middle East. And maybe that project is Iran. I mean, we heard a lot about the Iranians sending their LEU, the low-enriched uranium, to Turkey. The Turks have said, yes, they would like to. I mean, I don't think Ahmadinejad will do it, but nonetheless. But this is a way of improving your bona fides with the, shall we say, with the region, with the Muslim world in the region, but with countries like especially with Iran, that maybe that's a way of building a certain rapport with Iran, and Iran can't say that, oh, you're too close to the Israelis, because they're not too close to the Israelis. And Ahmadinejad just congratulated Erdogan when Erdogan was in Tehran 10 days ago, saying what a wonderful thing he's doing with the Israelis. So it is maybe a way of shifting, and this is only a hypothesis. I don't know, nobody has told me this. Finally, in terms of reasons, maybe there's a grander strategy here, and this is purely speculative. And when I say it's speculative, it's also brand new. I haven't really thought it through, but I decided I was going to say it anyway, and maybe people can hit me with it. Look at what's happening in the Middle East. You have the decline of the traditional Sunni powers, Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Egypt is completely frozen by Mubarak, by the succession crisis. The Saudis are so petrified of the Iranians and the Shia government in Iraq that they can't see straight. And maybe, and you hear this more from Arabs talking about Turkey, that maybe Turkey is the emerging Sunni power. And that doesn't mean it has to reduce its relations, I mean, eliminate its relations with Israel, but it has to definitely downgrade them. But a Sunni power, an important Sunni power, also has good relations with the Shia. It's not one of enmity, but it is trying to become the important Sunni power in the region. Now, this is purely speculative. It came out of conversations I had with a colleague, a friend of mine. Oops, I've gone up. All right, so let me stop here, and the future I don't know.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. We are now, I think we have 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes to open the floor to questions. Yes, please. And just wait for the mic. It might take a few minutes, but it's coming. The lady here. Yes.
Thank you very much. I was wondering what, if any, influence the Gulen Movement has on developments within the AKP and vis-à-vis Israel.
Look, I think the Gulen Movement, first of all, it's a moderate movement. It is not, I think, at an individual level, maybe at the group level, they also approve of what Erdogan has done in terms of his policies towards Israel. But I don't necessarily think of them as a driving force in this issue. First of all, the Gulen Movement is more interested in domestic affairs, especially civil-military relations and so on and so forth. But it is not, from what I can tell, a movement that is trying to impose essentially a foreign policy. And when you look at the Gulen Movement, it has been actually quite open, much more so than AKP. Well, I would say even if it has an influence on AKP, it has been a positive influence towards the minorities in terms of the Gulen Movement has had good relations with all the minorities, religious minorities in Turkey, whether Jews or Armenians or Greeks. So I don't see them as essentially having being behind this or the driver behind this.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your clarity. With all this constant hammering on Israel and this growing disdain toward American Jews, here's another contradiction. How do you account for the Turkish embassy having contracts with 1, 2, or 3, depends on which day you're talking about, Jewish organizations or people designate to be the go-between between Jewish organizations and the Turkish government? Secondly, the Turkish government, in all its facets, always has talked about its, quote-unquote, very good historic relations with the Turkish Jewish community since 1492. So what's happened to the local Jewish community?
Well, I mean, I think there's no contradiction. I don't see any contradiction there. I mean, Turkey has always, before this government, you can go back to many, many governments, will always say that they had a very good relationship with the Jews, that they welcomed the Jews, and in some ways, yes, they did after the Inquisition and after World War II. But there also has been a lot of bad incidents and there have been pogroms and there have been special taxes and so on. I mean, you can go on and on. I mean, it's a little bit of a mix, but Turks tend to emphasize only that positive part of it. That said, to the extent that the Ottoman past plays a role in modern AKP thinking, the Ottomans looked. The Ottoman Empire was this magnificent empire, which, in many ways, until it started to crumble, was an empire that benefited from diversity, sought diversity, not just with Jews, by the way. I mean, remember, the empire started in the West first, so it had to accommodate the Serbs and the Bulgarians and the Greeks and stuff like that. So it incorporated all these religious minorities and created this millet system whereby, yes, a religious minority was a second-class citizen but still tolerated, well-treated, well-cared for, unless you rose up, obviously, against the empire. But so there is this still benevolent way of looking at the minorities. So this government, in that sense, is not different. It thinks of all the minorities, including the Jews, as kind of what we call dimni. I mean, i.e., people who pay extra taxes but don't do. It's not exactly true anymore, but that's how they're approached. So it's not contradictory. Yeah, you saw it. I suggested that he tried to say something nice about Jews. I mean, I think. But they are making a lot of progress. I mean, remember, this is supposedly an Islamist government that has done much more in terms of improving relations with the minority than all the secular governments that came before. The secular governments or the secular opposition today sees the minorities as enemies. These guys don't. So, in that sense, that's important. And in terms of the embassy here, look, realpolitik is realpolitik. I mean, diplomacy has to be played out the way you think is best. That they use Jewish in-betweens, I mean, maybe tomorrow they'll use an Armenian, I don't know. I mean, so I think we shouldn't make too much out of it.
Yes. Yeah. 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 Yes, and then we'll
On your
move
last point, your speculation about what may be happening as far as the future is concerned, Turkey's asserting leadership in the Sunni world and perhaps reaching out also to the Shia world.
You have to speak now.
I'm sorry. On your last speculation about the future of Turkey's policy or its aspirations for leadership in the Middle East among the Sunni states, perhaps reaching out also to the Shia, isn't that in tension with your declaration at the outset, which is that Turkey is not turning to the East, but rather wants to retain its relationship with the West, and particularly membership in the European Union? How can it do both?
Yeah, well, look, if you talk to Turkish decision makers, they will tell you that they can do both. And they're certainly trying to do both, and I think until we're proven wrong, I think we have to take them at face value. Why are the two compatible? Turkey is still moving towards Europe in a sense, trying to open up chapters in the acquis. The Armenian opening was actually part of this. It's partly American domestic, but it is also targeted towards the European Union. The Kurdish, I mean, look, what is happening in terms of the Kurdish opening in Turkey. In fact, that is the most important thing that's happening. I mean, it's not our topic today. The most important thing that's happening in Turkey, and it has happened in Turkey probably in more than a few decades. So all of these are pushing Turkey, I mean, are improving Turkey's chances of being part of Europe. Now, being part of Europe doesn't mean you can't play a dominant role in somewhere else. I mean, to some extent, you can argue that Germany for a long time played an important role in Eastern Europe, at least the way the Turks think about it is that the more influence and sway Turkey has in the Middle East, in other words, the more important it is, the more attractive a candidate it becomes to the European Union, because the European Union is bringing in an actor that has the ability to maybe put some order in the one neighborhood that Europeans are terrified of. Right? The one argument against Turkey becoming a member of the EU, I mean, in Sarkozy's mind, Sarkozy keeps saying it's not part of Europe. What he really means is that its borders are Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and we don't want Europe's borders to be with those countries. That's what he really, I think, is afraid of. Right? But if Turkey can prove that it is a power that has influence and can actually put order in its region, then it becomes a very valuable instrument. And it's also this, the Plan B. What if Europe says no? I mean, Turkey will be the first case where a candidate country somebody may say no to a candidate country, Europe may say no to a candidate country. And if you are the Turkish, wouldn't you develop your second strategy? You should. It makes sense.
Yes.
Although you said that you're not going to be talking about the future, my question is a little related to the future. Having read from the news recently, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Syria wants to restart the mediation process again, including Turkey in it. And Israeli Prime Minister said that Turkey is not seen as the liable mediator any longer, and wanted France to be taking its part. So, and would we conclude something like Israelis lost their trust for Turks in that sense?
Yeah, it's fine. I'm glad you asked that question, because there was one thing I wanted to say which I forgot. Yes, it's true that the Syrians want the Turks in there. It makes sense now, because Turkey in their mind is more pro-Syrian than it is obviously pro-Israeli, and Assad has developed this relationship with Erdogan, and this is a way of paying back Erdogan. But I think Assad also knows that it's very unlikely that the Israelis will accept the Turks at this stage. I mean, look, the government of Israel has to answer ultimately to its own population, and I'm sure, given the sentiment at the moment, it would be rather unintelligent, so shall we put it mildly, that for the Israelis to do this. However, the interesting thing is that last week, in the summit in Istanbul, Assad told Erdogan that he has to maintain good relations with Israel. Even Assad, to some extent, is worried about the course, because he understands that, I mean, it goes back to the first part of the relationship under AKP, where AKP understood that Israel was important if you wanted to be an important. So Assad is basically saying to Erdogan, look, you have to go back to the old policy, because he's worried. He understands that Israelis are not going to participate with the Turks in, and he doesn't want the Americans in. He wants the Turks in, or at least if the Americans were to come in, he wants the Turks to balance them.
Yes, the lady in red just next, and then here in the back. Yeah.
Thank you. I had a question about the Jewish community in Turkey. There have been times where Turkish officials, when they haven't been happy with what the American Jewish community has been doing or how hard they've been lobbying for Turkey, they have insinuated that they can't protect
First of all, I don't, look, there is among the Jewish community a great deal of consternation at the moment because of the discourse. And when you have such discourse, ultimately it does reflect itself in among the public. After Gaza, you know, you had lots of incidents where people put signs in restaurants saying dogs and Jews are not allowed and things like that. So that creates a certain amount of nervousness, and you're seeing it, you're feeling it, and people are, more Jews are thinking of emigrating now when they hadn't been. I mean, for the last 10, 15 years, there's been essentially a very stable community. But that said, I don't necessarily think that there is this notion that they threaten the Jewish community is not really true, and I would say that this government is particularly sensitive and would not employ such tactics. With the American Jewish community, look, the American Jewish community, let's be honest, the reason the Turks improved relations with Israel was to get favor initially with the American Jewish community. Why? Because they think the American Jewish community controls the world. Right? I mean, it's simple. I mean, it's not, the Arab world also thinks the same way. You know, the lobby. Everything that happens is because somebody presses a button somewhere in the Jewish community. And to some extent, that's the mindset. It's unfortunate, but this is the reality. But now with the Armenian opening, I mean, they kind of resented somehow. They were always looking. It appeared as if, and when you read the press, that, oh, they were coming to the United States and when they were meeting the Jewish community, kind of paying homage to this great power. And this was demeaning to them. But it was only demeaning to them in their own mind and in the press, because I don't think the American Jewish community was necessarily looking at it that way. I mean, they were looking from a purely business relation. What can you do for me? What can I do for you? That second, now with the Armenian opening, the question of the Armenian genocide issue becomes less important, because the likelihood of that passing, if the opening to Armenia continues on a positive course, the genocide issue is going to die in Congress. So there's no much need anymore for the community, the American Jewish community, to carry water for you.
Yes, please, in the back.
Thanks. It's Kemal Kirişçi from the Transatlantic Henri, you beat me to the line. I was going to bring up that point about Bashir, but I was in Damascus last week, and there too a number of people brought this up. I mean, Syrians as well as Arab journalists, how important it is that Turkey maintains its image as a neutral in the Middle East. I think also at Istanbul Forum, you were there, a number of people came up to it. But my reading of your presentation, Henri, is one where you are between the lines calling on us to not to see the picture in black and white terms. And on the issue of AKP's relations with Israel, I agree with the points you made. I mean, let's not forget that it was AKP who invited Shimon Peres to address the Turkish parliament with Mahmoud Abbas. But from my point of view, it was a historic event. I mean, how many Muslim assemblies can you think of, let alone assemblies where an Israeli official or leader would be allowed to...
Your question, please. We are running out of time.
If you will allow me...
I'm sorry, I truly... just your question, please.
My question is, Henri, do you think it is appropriate to attribute so much to the military in terms of the initial relationship and in the mid-1990s? As you pointed out, it was preceded by, I think, civilian relations with the signing of the Oslo Accords. And how do you see the future, as our friend raised the question, if relations between the Arab world and Israel, or there is some progress in respect to peace in the Middle East? Thanks.
Thank you.
Why do I attribute so much importance to the military? Yes, it's true that relationships started before 1996, and in fact trade blossomed afterwards, and the military had nothing to do with that except for the military purchases. But if you remember those days, if it wasn't for the fact that the military insisted on it, the government at the time would never have signed it, one. Two, it was an agreement that had many different clauses and was kept secret for the longest time, creating also this aura about what it contained, and people were, especially in the Arab world, were very worried until the Turks leaked it to the Egyptians so that they wouldn't be worried. But the truth of the matter is it contained an element that would not probably have happened under maybe even any civilian government, let alone Erbakan's government. As for the future, if there is an improvement, yeah, I think I don't think Turkish-Israeli relations are going to, they may deteriorate somewhat more, but there is somewhere a bottom to that, one. Second, as I said earlier, I mean, a lot has to do with Israel's own actions and own isolation, and it's not just with Turkey. I mean, Turkey has kind of reached, if you want, the peak among its allies. But if there was a change in the peace process, absolutely. I mean, things will naturally improve. But I think the relationship with AKP is going to remain difficult. It's not. This is not going to go. Will be forgotten very, very easily. There were many. I mean, remember, as I said, the Israelis. Look, Ecevit accused the Israelis of genocide in Jenin. I mean, there's also a way in which the Turks accuse everybody of genocide, which is a little bit dangerous when they do that. But you know, and things went on and things improved. I mean, so you've always had these little crises. This one is different, right? And it will take a little bit of time for the damage to be repaired.
Just last questions, please, but just brief question. Yes.
That would be cynical when thinking of the Middle East. If the Israeli-Syrian negotiations had gone forward and been successful, the biggest loser, of course, would have been Iran. Is it too much to think that their handmaidens in Gaza kidnapped Khalid Shali in order to provoke the Israelis, who of course fell right into the trap, and crashed the negotiations as you described? Turkey then lost out. Iran was still an influential player. Is that too cynical?
No, I mean, I agree with you. There is no end to cynicism, or, you know, you can't be, enough cynical, let's put it this way, when it comes to the Middle East. But I would like to, I mean, there's a timeline problem there. Khalid Shalit was taken in 1996, 2006, I'm sorry. The Gaza War occurred December 2008, January 2009. That brings up another issue. When Khalid Mishal came to Ankara, one of the arguments that the Turks made at the time was, look, we have influence with Hamas, and therefore, excuse me, we'll be able to help you on the Shalit business. Well, the Turks proved that they don't have any influence with Hamas. Right? This is also goes back to the problem with overconfidence. They think they can deliver in every issue, but in the one issue where they could have delivered, which was Shalit, they never did. And the irony is, if again, to answer your question, Kamal, in terms of the future, the one thing that would change dramatically the relationship between Israel and Turkey is if the Turks were not to intervene and force Hamas somehow to get Shalit out. Because Shalit now has become such a rallying point in Israel that it's very difficult not to put up, when you think of the blockade of Gaza, etc., without Shalit coming out, there won't be any meaningful change in the status of Gaza. So if the Turks want to help the Gaza and the Palestinians, and if they want to repair some of the damage with the Israelis, get Shalit out. But I suspect that Hamas is not going to listen to Erdogan, despite Erdogan's popularity. I mean, if he were to put his mind to it, maybe he can get it done. But he will have to pay a price, obviously. I mean, use up some political capital. So I don't think Iran was necessarily involved didn't do it to create this crisis.
Please join me in thanking Henri Barkey for an excellent presentation.